My name is Jordan Weiss, and I'm a JCPA Board Member from Detroit, Michigan. And it is my honor to be moderating this panel with Tamar Hermann and David Makovsky. Professor Tamar Hermann is a senior research fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute and the academic director of the Viterbi Family Center for Public Opinion and Policy Research. The center applies rigorous, innovative, and pioneering research methods to document the attitudes of the Israeli public regarding thousands of issues in all aspects of life: politics, culture, ideology, religion, education, and national security. Since 2010, Professor Hermann has headed the team which develops and produces the annual Israel Democracy Index, and since 2018, the monthly Israeli Voice Index. Between 1994 and 2018, she produced the monthly Peace Index in collaboration with Professor Ephraim Yar of Tel Aviv University. Professor Hermann is a professor of political science at the Open University. She previously taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv University, and has been a guest lecturer at various universities, including Princeton, Queen's College in Belfast, WZB in Berlin, Fabia University in Fabia, Italy, and Sciences PO in Paris. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Project on Arab-Israel Relations. He's also an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. In 2013 and 2014, he worked in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, author of numerous Washington Institute monographs and essays on issues related to the Middle East peace process and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's also co-author with Dennis Ross of Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. Mr. Makovsky is also the host of the podcast Decision Points, the U.S. Israel Relationship, which features interviews with authors, scholars, and practitioners on key moments in the history and present of the United States-Israel relationship. It's my pleasure to bring you this conversation with them today as part of JCPA 2021. Maybe I'll just see if you each want to make brief introductions, and then we'll move to Tamar for her presentation.
Okay, hi, here in Israel, it's almost 11 at night. So I guess that today nothing horrible happened in Israel, and this is a good night for us, because never a dull moment here. There is a very famous song, either a scandal or festival. So today we didn't have a scandal, a new scandal, nor a festival, but we've been experiencing a very, very interesting time since our last elections, and I'll try to explain what is happening here from the point of view of Israeli public opinion. So, Bobby, if you'll be so kind as to show my presentation.
And Tamar, if I can just interrupt for 1 second, I'm going to remind everybody that there is a Q&A tab. I will be keeping an eye on any of the questions that are asked in there, and after the presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to them after the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, so my first comment on Israeli public opinion is that Israeli public is highly politicized, highly interested in politics, and also participate quite vigorously in a variety of political actions. Actually, if you look at the international different indices, Israel scores very high on public political participation. You'll see in a minute that participation means elections, but it also means a variety of protest activities, civil society organizations, and so on and so forth. This doesn't mean that Israelis are not very tired of what is happening in the last couple of years in Israel. And although they do have opinions, they have opinions about everything, but they do have political opinions as well. And many of them do follow the facts, but they are following less and less the political discussion. And this is a novelty in Israeli political culture, because in the past, Israelis used to follow the political discussion very, very closely. So let's move to my first slide. Bobby? Okay. I can hardly see it. Can you see it?
Can everyone see this on the screen?
Yeah, I see it.
Yes, it's the bigger box on our video.
It's very, very small on my computer, but I don't know. Anyway.
Tamar, try to click on the picture.
I clicked on the picture and it just moved. It didn't expand, Bobby. Anyway, I'll try to do it from here. So this is the list of our elections. We had the first one on March 2019. 11 parties crossed the threshold. Turnout was 68%. Which is pretty high in comparison to other liberal democracies. And one should also keep in mind that many eligible voters, Israelis, that is, do not live in Israel. So they could not participate. Anyway, if we add, or we will calculate it only based on the people who are in Israel, it amounts to 72, 73%, which is very nice. Largest party, Likud, and Prime Minister was Netanyahu. Then in September 2019, we had another election, 9 parties then. Turnout was almost 70%. Again, largest party, Likud, Prime Minister Netanyahu. These were the 2 pre-COVID-19 elections, and then we reached March 2020. 8 parties crossed the threshold. This is already during the corona pandemic crisis. Turnout 71.5%. And this is interesting because people thought, or many commentators expected, that Israelis would not show up and will not take part in the elections. However, as you can see, participation increased. Largest party, again, Likud. Prime Ministers Netanyahu and Gantz. Gantz, of course, crossed the lines, and from an anti-Netanyahu position, he became a partner to the Netanyahu government. This had some severe implications in terms of the Israelis' trust in the leaders, and indeed, as I'll show you in a minute, level of trust in Israel right now in the political system and the establishment is pretty low. And this is very problematic from the democratic point of view. Then we had the March, it's 2021, 13 parties, turnout 67%, largest party, again, Likud, Prime Minister. We don't know, because for the last couple of weeks, we've been seeing this kind of a game between those who say, okay, Netanyahu is going to take it again, or Netanyahu is going to leave his office and his residence in Balfour Street. So maybe the protest was successful against Netanyahu, that is, and we still don't know whether we are going to have another Netanyahu government, or as we call it now, a change government rather than anti-Netanyahu government. Next slide, please. Okay. As the title I gave to this presentation was Divided We Stand, and indeed divisions within Israeli society are very, very critical for the political developments here. We see that the primary source of tension in Israeli society by the Israeli public opinion is the division between left and right. And this graph looks like exact sciences, not like social sciences. In 2012, 9% said that this is the main division. Then in 2015, 18%, 24%, 32%, 37.5%, and then 39, almost 40%. This means that the division between left and right has become much more acute. What does it mean, left and right? It doesn't mean left and right as we knew them in the 90s. It is not about Israel and Palestine. It is not about territorial compromises. It is not about Israelis and Palestinians. It's about everything. It is quite similar to Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Left and right are different on a variety of issues: LGBT rights, women's rights, state and religion, economy, you just name it. It is not all about Netanyahu. There is a very strong correlation between people's position on the left-right continuum and their self-definition on the scale of religiosity. In other words, we find in all surveys almost zero ultra-Orthodox, for example, who define themselves as being on the left or even in the center, whereas the majority of the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox define themselves as being on the right. And this is critical because right now the National Orthodox camp is divided to two parties. Used to be only one party in the past, Mafdal, then Yemina. And now we find ourselves with two Orthodox parties, Yemina and National Zionism, led by Bezalel Smotrich. Bezalel Smotrich is the biggest opponent to the inclusion of any Arab party in the upcoming coalition, and he might be the reason why Netanyahu will not be able to create a stable opposition or a coalition or a coalition at all. Next slide, please. Okay, so what bothers Israelis these days? What are their main concerns? In the past, we used to say it's all about security, security, security. Apparently, as things stand today, most Israelis thought in 2019 and in 2020 that security is being taken care for successfully. So it is not all about security. It is about social economic issues, welfare, social divisions, gaps, unemployment, and so on and so forth. This means that they perceive the government as quite successful in delivering security, but as highly unsuccessful in delivering the right standard of living and a sense of economic and social security. And this is a major change in the political life in Israel. Next slide, please. Okay. Statistically, as you can see, we have a Jewish majority and an Arab minority, like 3/4 are Jews and 21% are Arabs. And in the past, Arabs were not part of the ruling coalition. They served in the past as some kind of a safety net. We did have some Arab parties in the very far past, but they were like satellite parties to Zionist parties. They were not pure Arab parties. And now we have two Arab parties. One is the Joint List, who are much more nationalistic and sympathize with the Palestinian cause. And the other party is the southern branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in Israel. They are headed by Mansour Abbas, and Mansour Abbas did something that was unthinkable in the past, he actually opened the door for a coalition with the Likud party and other right-wing parties, because his main argument is the Arabs should be more concerned with their civil status within Israel rather than with the Palestinian cause. And at the beginning, it was thought of as a gimmick, but apparently he's going to be one of the kingmakers in the near future. What about political blocs? As you can see, we have a majority of people defining themselves as being on the right, almost 60%, 55%. We have 1/3 at the center and only 12% self-defined as being on the left. And this is very different than what we had in the past. Next slide, please. Okay, what are people's concerns in Israel? As you can see, people are quite optimistic about the future of Israel's national security. It is almost 2/3 saying, yes, we are optimistic about it. However, only a minority of around 40% are optimistic about the future of the Israeli democratic regime. Next slide, please. And as I said, we are highly divided on this issue. As you can see on the right, around 1/3 are concerned about the dangers to the Israeli democratic regime. At the center, we already have a majority. And on the left, it's a huge majority, almost a consensus, that Israeli democracy is in grave dangers. The reasons for saying that Israel's democracy is in grave danger between the left and the right are the total opposite. Whereas on the left, the main danger, the perceived main danger, is the situation in which the government is actually targeting the judiciary in Israel, whereas on the right, the reason they give us to their statement that Israeli democracy is in grave danger is the other way around. The judiciary actually runs over the political institutions, mainly the parliament, the Knesset, and the government. So even if they agree that there is a danger, they do not agree about the source of the danger. What is the origin of the danger? What is the danger? And this means that they cannot agree on anything because they see the danger coming from opposite directions. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, are people satisfied with the results of the latest elections? As you can see in the reds, no, people are not satisfied with the results of the elections. And we segmented it by people's self-identification with this or that block, and we didn't find a significant difference. So people on the right, in the center, and on the left, they are dissatisfied to almost the same amount. It is not because one camp or one political bloc feels that they lost the elections. This is because something doesn't work well in the Israeli political system. Next slide, please. Okay, which bloc has a better chance of forming a coalition? As you can see, it looks very colorful because there is no agreement which of the blocks have a better chance. However, there is some sense, or there was a sense, we did it 3 weeks ago, and in early April, it might be different these days, but actually the sense is that the Netanyahu-led coalition has some better chances of forming a coalition. I'm not sure that today this would be the segmentation of the answers, but it will not be dramatically different. Next slide, I think it's my last slide. Oh, chances that we are going to have a fifth round of elections, again, a huge majority. This will be the way out of the deadlock. Next slide. As I mentioned, we see that trust in the main democratic institutions, government, Knesset, and parties is very low. This is not unique to Israel. We see it in almost all liberal democracies. However, in Israel, it hits bottom rock, and it seems that Israelis actually have given up on the main democratic institutions in terms of trust. Next slide. Okay, and this is my last slide. The Arab issue. As I mentioned, Mansour Abbas said that he is going, or he is willing to positively consider joining forces with any government in Israel, providing that the government will grant the Arab citizens of Israel some very large budgets, that the police will be more active in preventing crime, and so on and so forth. However, as you can see, there is a big difference, again, between the three main political blocs regarding the consent of having a government which will at least have outside support from the Arab parties, whereas there is a majority on the left saying, yes, we don't have any problem with that. The center is more hesitant, and on the right, although there was an increase following Netanyahu's recent positive comments about the Israeli Arab citizens, still it is only a minority on the right that agrees to have a government based on outside support from the Arab parties. And this might be the reason of why Netanyahu will be unable to create a government, because without the support of Mansour Abbas's party, the number tells us that he can have only a minority government, and a minority government in Israel is something that can hardly survive for a long period of time. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar. We're going to pass things over to David, and after David's presentation, I'll bring you both back for a Q&A. And a reminder to everyone, there is a specific Q&A tab. Please feel free to ask any questions there, and we'll get to them after David's presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Tamar. I love sharing a platform with Tamar. It's a treat to be on with someone who I really respect so deeply, really one of Israel's leading figures when it comes to polling and political attitudes in the state of Israel. So thank you, Tamar, for sharing the platform, the virtual platform with me here on Zoom between Washington and Tel Aviv. Look, I think whoever organized this at JCPA, please think about JCPOA. Whoever organized this, I don't think could have imagined that this would be such a super dramatic week that we're about to see in Israel. Now, there's 9 days left. It's like there's a real countdown as Netanyahu he's got very limited choices. I think it's fair to say Tamar and I would never count out Benjamin Netanyahu. He's so skillful and savvy and outmaneuvering his rivals that until the last minute of the last hour, you cannot count this guy out. But I think Tamar will speak for herself. but I certainly think that this is the toughest position he's been in since he was prime minister in 2009, when he's been prime minister now for 12 consecutive years. And this is where, and you see the state of play slide, just is that the numbers are 52 pro-Netanyahu forces, 57 anti-Netanyahu forces, and 11 swing voters. And we're going to talk about the kingmakers in the swing states, in the swing players in a minute. But he's usually like setting the tempo of events. But now he's in such a corner that he doesn't have good options left. So I want to just talk about that for a moment, but I really want to talk about what are the implications for Israel, but also for American Jewry, and a group like JCPA with JCRCs across the United States has such a vital role. It's important that you understand how this relates to you and why. I know you all care, because you wouldn't be doing what you're doing if you didn't care, but it's really important to understand what is the kind of crossroads that Israel is at. And I know, with 4 elections, and, we just had Pesach not too long ago, Manishtana, how's this election different from all other elections? I know there's a kind of numbing effect, and people will just say, well, wake me up when it's over. But I really want people to realize that this is really a dramatic moment, and I will explain why. But let's go to the next slide for a minute, just briefly. I mean, Tamar touched on this, on the turnout. It is remarkable that everyone thought the Israeli public's going to be sick of going to the polls. 4 elections in 2 years. Come on. You say you're the most democratic country in the Middle East, but 4 elections in 2 years is ridiculous. But the fact is, as Tamar's slide showed you, with each round, participation went up. It's totally counterintuitive. It did dip this time, but it took COVID for it to dip. Yes, Israel was already in the vaccination mode, but not everyone was vaccinated, double vaccinated at that point. And so I do think it is remarkable. And Tamar is the one who really talks a lot about, the fact that Israelis self-identify more on the right. And we see it as in terms of right, center, left, in terms of the distribution of the new Knesset members. And Netanyahu, and I agree with Tamar completely, it's not just about pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi, but it has become the access point of Israeli politics for now. And but it does reflect some other divisions, about which I want to speak about in a moment. So what are the options now? What are the kingmakers here? And we'll go to the next slide. The kingmakers. So, Tamar mentioned Mansour Abbas, and I always want people to understand, how do these technical things connect to a bigger picture? And I think it's crucial to understand, if you look at the polling data, and I know Tamar's done it, and other pollsters have done it, there's a real generational shift among Israeli Arabs. A sense that it's enough already. We've been always in the grandstands, in the bleachers, as our leaders only talk about Palestinian issues. But the younger generation wants to be more integrated. They do see a country over $400 billion GDP, whose GDP per capita is on the size of France and Japan. And their leader, they thought to their leaders, what are you doing for us exactly? We've got a lot of crime in our areas, but we don't have police stations. Mansour Abbas's success in this election is that he's so single-minded in talking a language that Israeli Jews understand, which is, we're citizens of this country, we need to be more engaged, and we deserve services. And everyone admits it. And it's ironic that it's coming from the right, from Netanyahu, and you could say it makes it kosher. If you looked at Tamar's slide, when they said people on the right even, it's been a huge shift between 10 and 34%, even in the center from 38 to 55%, who believe that the Arabs should be part of the political system. Now, when it's called support from the outside, for those of you who don't follow all the nuances of Israeli politics, that means in parliamentary votes that there's a safety net, that governments don't fall. Because for Israeli Arabs, it is a big deal. If you're a former cabinet minister, you have to vote on raids on Gaza. Is that something you want to do? No. But if you look at 3 minority governments in the 90s, it was all based on the safety net idea. It didn't start on the safety net with regard to the Rabin government and the Barak government. Peres was unusual because it was an assassination that was so abrupt. It was more of a continuation of Rabin. This is different in that it would really start with a minority government. And that brings you to Naftali Bennett. And this guy seems to you very unlikely because some of you have been following him, and he's got his family is from the Bay Area in San Francisco and made Aliyah. He's a high-tech guy, speaks an idiomatic American English like Bibi does. He made millions in high-tech, and now is becoming the swing player in what seems to you, I'm sure in JCPA, is like one of the most improbable scenarios. And so maybe let's go to the next slide on that one. And so on one hand, I do think, you know, Bibi is on the brink, so to speak. Option one, he's trying, you know, on one hand, he's tried to split the Arab sector to draw votes away from him and said, hey, you know, Mansour Abbas, your social conservatism, you're like the Arab version of Shas. Now, in fact, this party was something that had supported the Islamist parties, as sees itself as like the branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this is a change for Israelis, but here's the icon of the right saying, well, look, maybe we can make this work. But ironically, and this to you is going to sound crazy, but the guy who's blocking him is the very person for Bibi to stitch this safety net together is not just Bennett, who people thought was reliably right-wing. Indeed, the name of his party is Yamina, right-wing, right word. But this party called Bezalel Smotrich, and a harder line right-wing faction, he was so convinced because of earlier rounds where hard right votes kind of went down the tubes. You remember, you know, if you don't have 4 seats, anything under that 4-seat limit is just wasted votes. So he was so concerned not to waste right-wing votes that he was one of the people stitching together this hard right party, and even agreed to one of their members being in the Likud list when they were squabbling over one name. But now this same Smotrich, the leader of this party, says, I'm not going to be in a government where this guy, Mansour Abbas, is the kingmaker, even though he's sitting outside the coalition. He will decide when he pulls the plug on us or doesn't. No way. And so Bibi doesn't really have any good options. His only option, I know you're going to think this is going to sound radical, what I'm about to say, his only option left is basically to take someone like, I don't know if his name is Yuli Edelstein, who was a speaker in the Knesset, or someone who is seen as more what they call mamlachti, someone who is viewed as more mainstream, and say, okay, you're prime minister for the next 2 years. Maybe that will get Gideon Sa'ar back, and who was the breakaway faction of the Likud, who was furious at Netanyahu. But Bibi's options are dwindling. This is like the countdown, like you've heard of the Omer between Passover and Shavuot up to 49 days. This is a reverse Omer, a reverse countdown where he's got 9 days left. And he's going to have to step back, it seems to me, to name someone else as prime minister. And then maybe on the back end, he could be prime minister because nobody trusts Netanyahu right now to go first in any rotation because he pulled the rug out from Benny Gantz, who was viewed as a Mr. Nice Guy kind of thing. So Bibi doesn't have a lot of options. Now, could he convince Smotrich at the last second? Smotrich is digging in hard, and Bennett is kind of got, you know, his feet out the door because he's trying to do option 2, which to people on JCRCs on this call will sound like, wow, this is something really new in Israel. Is this going to last? Which is a very novel idea that Bennett on the right, along with Gideon Sa'ar, Avigdor Lieberman on the right, joining Lapid, who's got the most votes in this whole group, and Gantz, who's also did fairly well in the elections, along with parties on the left, like Labor and Meretz, to form a real unity government that Israel has not seen before. It used to be the 2 big parties, but now things have fragmented, as Tamar said. So what the idea, Lapid is the magnanimous one because he kind of says, look, I get it that, you know, Bennett is not going to join a government without the prime minister. it's too hard for, that he's seen as taking right-wing votes. I'm willing to give in that I will not be the prime minister, and he with his 7 seats, me with my 17, but that Bennett will be the prime minister first for the next 2 years. And this is something we haven't seen, but if you follow Bennett's remarks on record, off record, on posts, backgrounders to the media, his posts on Facebook in the last week, he's said, it's clear that he wants, you can say, well, these politicians, they want to be prime minister, of course. But I think he's gotten into it that he could be the unifier. And this is the main point I want to make here. And I don't know if Bibi could pull a rabbit out of his hat. Like I said, to the last second of the last minute of the last day, I don't count this guy out. Because, is he really, can he give up control? It's so unlike him. But I'm sure there are people whispering, let Bennett try. He'll smash in 1,000 directions. As Tamar said, how long can a minority government last in Israel? But it could also be a moment, I think, a Biden moment for Israel. And Tamar kind of alluded to this about, a lot of America and Israel, we're very different, of course. But there's elements that are becoming more similar, which is the faith in institutions. And faith in the independence of institutions, and the fear of greater polarization of the society, and therefore, basically, what Bennett's language is, he's trying to borrow from Biden. He's talking about a government of national healing. He's talking about a government that's going to focus on COVID relief because of all the small businesses that have been wiped out in Israel. He's talking about a budget. He's talking about an infrastructure bill. Does that sound familiar to Americans? That I think is key. Now, Iran is also something that is more consensus in Israel. It's less divisive than it is in this country. So that is not a focal point of difference, I think. There's a kind of subcontracting of the Iran issue to the security establishment because it's viewed as kind of technical and abstract. And there's the Abraham Accords, which is also consensus. So in many ways, this government of national healing that Bennett is talking about has a lot of hope. And here's the one that I hope if you remember only one sentence of what I say from this whole opening remarks, you'll remember this sentence that I think has implications for us as American Jews. And we'll see if they could come through with it. But one of the threads that unites Bennett with some of these other factions is a belief that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel have too much power. And that even Avigdor Lieberman, who's viewed as anti in many ways, but he's saying you have the Rabbanei Tzohar. The Tzohar are the liberal Orthodox. It's true, it's not reform and conservative, but it's a liberal strand of Israel that says that the ultra-Orthodox have alienated Judaism from many. And we got to reclaim it. We have to make Judaism relevant. We have to make it humane. We have to make it something people want to be a part of. And they perform a lot of the weddings in Israel. And they have a very different line, tone, philosophy than the standard ultra-Orthodox. So that is really interesting that the ultra-Orthodox would be left out of this government. Although, some believe in a year from now that they're going to need money from their schools, they will join. They claim they won't. Some say even 6 months, who knows? But this could be an interesting experiment in also reducing the religious tensions between Israel and American Jews. And I think that's something you guys care very much about. And that's why I say follow this space over the next 9 days, whether this thing happens or not, because that is something that unites, whether it's, Bennett might be right-wing religiously, but politically, but he's not right-wing religiously. I think he talks openly that his wife isn't even Orthodox. And then you've got these other factions who have kind of chafed and believe that the ultra-Orthodox have excess power. So this is something really to follow. This is an amazing experiment if it works. How long can it work for? What sort of reforms can they make? I think it is an open question. Now, if they fail, right now it's down to who's the Minister of Defense and who's not the minister and who's the Minister of Justice and all these things in which political junkies like Tamar and I follow, but many of you don't care about. But I mean, Bennett wants to go to Rivlin in 9 days from now by saying, we've worked it out. Here's the new government of Israel. for the first time of the post-Netanyahu era. Now, just to say the words post-Netanyahu seem hard to believe, and I wouldn't count the guy out, even if Bennett forms the government, because he could be the head of the opposition. He will. He's not retiring, and he's got to go to his court case maybe 3 times a week. So it's a remarkable moment in Israel's history, though, that 12 years since 2009, that Israelis have grown up only knowing Benjamin Netanyahu. There's a whole generation only knew Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. There could be a shift. Now, again, don't count Bibi out. Maybe he'll step back and give the baton to someone else on the right that has more appeal and could bring Bennett and Saar back. We'll see. But I think these are some really dramatic days. But it's just striking to me how there seems certain convergences in American and Israeli society of what should a new government focus on. Now, I don't want to make it sound like they're going to solve everything, because they're not. And Tamar told you about the differences over, judicial activism. That's a problem in our country too. There's a real philosophical range of views, like there is in Israel. The Palestinian issue, an issue that's very dear to my heart, that is clearly an issue. So issues where there is no consensus, I don't see this government, a minority government, making dent in those 2 areas, the judicial issue and the Palestinian issue. But on all these other issues, like where Biden is trying to do in our country, coming after Trump, I do see some similarities. And I think that it's something very exciting to watch. But we'll know in 9 days if it happens. But certainly on the Israel diaspora relations, where issues over religious tension has been part of that friction, this could be a real shift. So my point to everyone is stay tuned. We're entering some very dramatic days in Israel. And anyway, I look forward to the conversation and the discussion with Tamar going forward. But thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so much, David. So I'll start with an easy one and put you both on the spot. Are we going to have a government, or are we going to go to 5th elections without actually a new prime minister sitting, whether it's the same prime minister or an actual new prime minister?
Happy for Tamar to go first for her view.
Oh, Tamar, you're still muted.
She's on mute. Tamar's on mute. It says mute. I don't know.
Yeah, either at the bottom, there you go.
Okay.
Well, I don't do prophecies. This is lesson 101 in political science. But there were some polls recently indicating that the results of the 4th elections are going to be repeated in the 5th elections, that there was no electoral shift in the last couple of weeks. So I suppose that the taste for 5th elections is not so good for most politicians. I don't see them running into this repeated game. I mean, nobody in Israel actually feels on a very solid ground that he or she are going to win the 5th election. So why should they put themselves in the same situation, having also a responsibility of initiating 5th elections? So we are stuck in a dead end, and some of the experts here in Israel actually maintain that until the electoral system is reformed, we will not get out of this very dismal situation.
I would look at it like this, Jordan. The way I see it is, I agree with Tamar that most of the politicians don't want a 5th election, and they're sick of it. In the case of Bennett, he's gone, you could say, he's gone a bridge too far, in that, a lot of his voters are right wing, and in their view, the icon of the right, he's bringing down the icon of the right. And so either this gamble works for him and he wins big and tries to rechange the political map, and he'll have people see him as you're now the incumbent prime minister of Israel, albeit with a rotation, or he's, he could go into the next round without constituents. So he's got the most to lose, I think, for the fifth round. Bibi, I think, will just want to keep going because, he'll want to be a caretaker until there's an election. He could play this out longer, but I don't think he's got the cards. I mean, I just think it's down to getting inside this guy's head, which is, in his mind, I think because he could be very rational for cost benefit for his own political survival, is what's better for me? To let Bennett succeed and put together this government and let it collapse of its own weight of contradictions, and then I pick up the pieces? Or maybe that's not so simple because he'll play it carefully along the lines I said, like here are the 6 things that are consensus things he can do. And therefore, I've got to do something I thought I'd never do, which is name a successor in the Likud and let that person be the prime minister. I mean, I won't even get into all the permutations, and now the presidency is up too. So Rivlin's term is ending. Will Bibi, go that way? But I don't know if he will. But it would mean for him almost to pull a Putin in a certain way. I don't want to make these analogies too direct, but Putin named Medvedev to be like the boss at one point, and then took it back a couple years later. So it's down to getting into one guy's head. I think more than it is about political attitudes of a public. There's not that many cards left. 9 days, one move. There's one move on the chessboard. You're going to do it. You're not going to do it. For a while, he toyed with the idea that he could threaten Smotrich by doing what Bibi does better than anybody, which is going 360 degrees around any political person he's trying to court, seduce, threaten, intimidate, and say, okay, who is his rabbi? Who are his in-laws? Who are his neighbors? Who is his wife? How do I convince this guy? But it's not working with Smotrich, and they just got 30 rabbis to support him, some prominent names that, Mansour Abbas should have that balance of power. So, I don't think he has that card. I think there's one move on the chessboard. You either, do the unknown and push someone through who is not you, and you become the foreign minister or whatever, or you let Bennett try, and maybe Bennett fails, and then you pick up the pieces. So it's that calculation will decide the next 9 days, as I see it. And I want to be clear, even if Bennett succeeds with this, and it'll be a huge story, I think, in the United States when it happens, because for Americans also haven't seen anyone but Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister of Israel for a very long time. The question will be, how long can it last? If he can avoid the hot button issues, Palestinians and judicial reform, and focus on consensus like COVID relief, infrastructure, et cetera, he might be able to do this longer. Right now, the glue for that government is an anti-Netanyahu glue. But once it's formed, will that glue persist? And that's, Bennett's bet is it could, because they'll focus on consensus issues and they'll avoid hot button issues. But it's the Middle East. It's Israel. There's always issues that pop up here. There were 40 rockets from Gaza on Friday night. As it is, Bibi decided not to retaliate. It's Ramadan, and he saw this is going to be just an endless cycle. But there are things that you don't control, and they will pop up. So you can't just say it'll only be consensus issues that you're going to be dealing with. There could be issues that are not consensus.
And so I'm going to combine 2 questions here that are kind of on the same note. One, how has the potential revival of an American participation in the Iran nuclear agreement and how have the so-called Abraham Accords had on internal Israeli politics? And the other side of that is, do either of you have any insight to whether or how the Biden administration is trying to influence the current Israeli political scene?
Well, the Abraham Accord was welcomed by the majority in Israel, both Jews and Arabs, by the way. because for the Israeli Jews, it was a novelty. Many of them went to Dubai and they were welcomed by the people there. Israel is part of the Middle East, and Israelis love the Arab culture and the Arab food and the way that they were treated there. Specifically, they liked the Abraham Accord because it was very bad for the Palestinians, because it actually showed a way of integrating in the Middle East without making any concessions to the Palestinians, without consulting the Palestinians, actually having some significant Arab player on Israel's side, as if the Palestinian issue is already over. So from the Israeli point of view, it was a big achievement. And then there was some moves done by Netanyahu in the context of the elections. He actually wanted to impose a visit on the Emiratis, and they didn't respond in the positive, and they said no, until the elections are over, you're not welcome here. He tried twice, and there was also a mini crisis with Jordan, so the Jordanians didn't let him to fly over Jordan, and it was cancelled. So some of the thrill, the initial thrill of the Israelis from these accords has dissipated recently, but I think that it was a very significant move in terms of the very ability to have positive relations with some Arab countries, regardless of what's happening on the Palestinian front. So this is it. As for the Biden administration, I don't know what's happening behind the screen, but basically we don't feel anything here. It is not, as if it is not in the cards right now that the Biden administration will intervene in the present domestic political crisis. The Biden administration is not taking any side here in the open. Of course, we don't know what's happening in the very dark corners, but basically it is not present here. And this is a very, very different situation than in former elections, where the Trump administration actually intervened very, very forcefully in what was happening in Israel, with the Golan Heights, with Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. So Israelis are actually looking to Washington. I'm not saying looking up to Washington. They are looking to Washington and are saying, what is happening with this guy? Because they expected Biden to be quite insistent that Israel will immediately start renegotiating with the Palestinians, and nothing happens on this front. On the Iranian front, however, he is actually playing his cards exactly like the Israelis expected him to play his cards. So there is no surprise here. There are no hopes here. There is a bit of surprise from the fact that he is not taking sides until now, please.
Jordan, my take on it is similar but a little different. Look, on one hand, in terms of the impact on the elections, to your question, you know, Bibi before the Abraham Accords in the last round got, in the third round of elections, had 36 seats. After the Abraham Accords, he had 30 seats. Now, Tamar's 100% right that the Abraham Accords are an amazing consensus. You know, Israel, that in Israel, you can't even get 80% of Israelis to agree if it's light outside or dark outside. But there's a wide view that a peace with a wealthy Arab state is great. And if you looked at the annexation debate that we were having last summer, remember that? But once the Emirati breakthrough happened, and that was their condition, that if there's a breakthrough, there's no annexation, at least for 4 years, 80 to 20 said better normalization with the Emirates versus annexation. It had 20. It looked like it was a mile wide annexation, but it was an inch deep, because the Israelis understood that this is a big deal. And Tamar said, look at all the Israelis who went there. Look, during a pandemic, 140,000 people went in a pandemic. If you look at the polling, if you look at the numbers of tourists in 2019, pre-pandemic, 4.3 million Israelis traveled abroad. That's half the country, or 9.1, so it's just under half. And so imagine it is unbelievable, the impact that the upside here is unbelievable in terms of tourism. It's not just tourism. MBZ issued, Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince, issued basically, I mean, they issued a statement saying that they want to engage in Israel. How do we invest $10 billion in Israel in the high-tech sector and the like? You know, the Bibi shouldn't have publicly said, I'm the one who did it, and that's, in my view, what led to the cancellation of the visit on the eve of an election. But the point is that if Shimon Peres was alive, you know, this was the peace he was hoping for, a peace between peoples, not just a peace between governments. So it's enormous upside. If, you know, as a leaders, all of you in the American Jewish community, I think you should realize that this peace, I think, has a chance to be like a rocket ship in a way that we haven't seen before. This is not to denigrate peace with Jordan and Egypt that are strategically crucial because of the security services working together, and Jordan and Egypt are on Israel's borders. Jordan helps patrol the borders. So those, I'm not here to knock anything on peace between governments, but this is like something we've never seen. If you have a college son or daughter and want them to follow something exciting about Israel, follow all the high-tech upside here, whether it's green tech, food tech, agri-tech, all the different types of tech that the Emirates are interested in when it comes to water, all sorts of things. This is really exciting. But it did help Bibi in terms of the actual election results. The Iran issue, to your second question, Jordan, look, the White House told me, they said, David, look, our goal is to stay out of this election. We feel no matter what we say, the right wing in Israel is just so savvy that they could flip around whatever we do. So we don't want to give it to them. Our view is stay low. And one White House person said there was some article of somebody, and they pointed out to me, they go, wow, the U.S. has been kind of absent. And they go, that was the best news. We don't want to be in this election. It's also because the Biden administration priorities are different. Except for the Iran nuclear negotiation, the Middle East is not a tier 1 issue. COVID, economic relief, climate change, China, racial justice. Those are the tier 1 issues, not the Middle East. I mean, people said how long it took Biden to call Bibi. It took a month. He didn't call anyone else either in the Middle East. Bibi was actually the first one he called. It's just the Middle East is not a tier 1 issue, and it's hard for American Jews to understand that. But in terms of the Iran negotiations, we don't have an extra session just on that. What I just would say on that one very, very briefly is the good news is that in the early days, it looks like everyone's learning from the Obama-Bibi confrontation of 2015. Nobody wants to go there. So everyone's walking on eggshells and being very polite publicly about the Iran negotiations, but there's a real policy gap between the U.S. and Israel about the Iran nuclear deal and whether there really will be a follow-on accord or not. If there would be a follow-on accord that was more restrictive, I think Israel would be more understanding, but I think there's real doubts in Israel whether it'll happen, because their view is to get to the nuclear deal, you're going to have to give up your leverage of the sanctions. And therefore, why would Iran agree to a follow-on deal that's more restrictive for them? So anyway, there's differences here, but right now everyone's being polite. No one wants 2015 in 2021 right now. So I hope that diplomatic good feeling remains, but boiling under the surface, there's real policy gaps.
Are you both okay to go 5 minutes over? We have permission if it's okay with you guys.
Great.
Okay, so I'm going to give you your choices of the rest of what we have in the Q&A. One, what happens with Bibi in court? how does it affect whether he's still in office? 2, how would this so-called unity government, which I imagine would be the Bennett and Center Party unity government, what would that mean for Israeli settlement policy? What would election reform actually look like? And will an Arab diplomatic presence in Israel have any impact on Israeli behavior in the West Bank? So please take your choices of what you feel like you can answer. We have 4 minutes left, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Should we each do 2? Tamar, do you want to do the electoral reform and the Israeli Arabs, or up to you?
Okay, the electoral reform is a very complicated issue because, as you know, there is no perfect electoral system, and it has to fit the political culture. And this is a problem in Israel because there is a quid pro quo between representation of small segments of Israeli society and efficacy. Okay? And we talk about governability and governability crisis, and this is why the electoral reform should be contemplated. However, most politicians and even many Israelis are not too keen on making the sacrifices that such reform will entail. Okay, they are not ready to say, okay, so we are done with the representation for our sector just in order to help the government govern. Okay, so we don't see anything like that in the horizon. Actually, the Israel Democracy Institute is advocating a very large set of reforms for years and years and years and years. And besides getting more donations, nothing happened. Okay, now the reform that my institute is advocating is having the leader of the largest party automatically as Israel's prime minister. So the morning after the elections, we will know who the prime minister is, and he or she will not need the vote of confidence of the Knesset in order to start creating a government. Although I get my salary from the Institute, I think that it's not going to work either, because there are such deep interests in keeping the system as is.
David, any final comments or
Look,
answers
my final
to those
comment,
questions?
and look, the court case thing, is clearly one of the reasons why Bibi wants to keep going, and because he feels that he's better off being in power while he's in court than just being a private citizen. That's kind of been the fuel of all these elections. It's the kind of elephant in the room in a certain way, why he just keeps going and doesn't give up. But again, what I said before stands. I mean, the court, he's got to, it's in 9 days. The court case will not be done in 9 days. We're in the active phase now of actually evidence and witnesses. But in 9 days, we won't know anything different. But there's a drumbeat of that, and it makes me wonder. Okay, is that going to nudge him to either name, an interim successor kind of thing, or is that going to nudge him to say, okay, Bennett, you go for it. You're not going to work, and I'm going to be like fierce as hell, breathing down your back as an opposition leader. How he calculates what's better for him, we'll have to see. Your point about, or the questioner's point about the settlements is great, because it's under the rubric of what I call the Palestinian issue. Because here they don't agree. It's clear that Nitzan Horowitz of the Meretz Party and Naftali Bennett of Yamina don't agree. The question to me is, how do they manage difference? Because this and the court reform, there's 3 Supreme Court justices up for naming in the coming year. How these guys navigate their differences is going to be whether they're just going to revert back to Bibi again, which they all say they don't want. So how they navigate is, are they going to only say that they're going to build inside the blocks? that means inside the security barrier, where 85% of Israelis over the green line are, in 8% of the land adjacent to Israeli urban areas. I thought it was fascinating, and with this I'll end, is that Bennett said, under this new government, there will be no annexation. But after all, Bibi didn't annex either. I mean, I think there's something about Bennett, about he knows if he's going to be the prime minister of this hybrid, you know, they'll either, you know, hang together or hang separately. And so I think right now he wants to navigate around the icebergs, and we'll have to see how successful he is. But the very fact that he does it will be something that will be an earthquake, because for 12 years in a row, there's only been Bibi Netanyahu. So all I could say to people, you know, is stay tuned. I want to thank everyone for listening to Tamar and me, and I wish you guys all success. And if I could be of any help to you, you know where to find me at the Washington Institute, because I know the JCRCs around the country do such incredibly important work. So good luck with all your efforts.
Thank you, Tamar, and thank you, David. We're so happy to have you guys with us. Thank you for educating us and sharing your insight. We really appreciate it. They were both terrific presentations and terrific information. We're sorry we can't run into you outside in the hallways during an in-person conference, but hopefully we will all be able to do that at JCPA 2022. We do have another plenary session coming up at 5 p.m. So thank you again, both of you, for joining us, and everybody in the audience. And we look forward to speaking more in the future.
Thank you very much. Good health, good spirits.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.